It's January 1882. You haven't eaten in 2 days. The fog coming off the Thames is so thick you can taste the coal in it. Your coat was stolen last week, off your own back, by someone who needed it more than you did. Or maybe they just needed it more than they needed to ask. You are not a murderer. You're not even particularly dangerous. But you are hungry, you are cold, and the city around you is a machine built to grind people like you into nothing. And you've learned something the respectable classes would rather not discuss. Winter has its own criminal economy, a parallel system of survival running just beneath the frozen surface of Victorian Britain. Some of it is desperate, some of it is ingenious. All of it will get you hanged, transported, or frozen solid in a Whitechapel doorway if you get it wrong. Here are 7 brutal ways Victorian outlaws survived the cold, and the thing they all have in common that no one in power wanted to admit. Number 7. The penny sit-up, the legal floor, and why it wasn't enough. Before we get to the outlaws, you need to understand what the alternative looked like. Because the criminal economy of a Victorian winter only makes sense when you understand what legitimate shelter actually cost. A penny. That's what it took to get off the streets on a January night in London. You'd shuffle into a common lodging hall and pay your coin for the right to sit on a bench until morning. Not sleep, sit. The management employed men specifically to stop you from drifting off. Some halls ran ropes across the benches, the famous 2-penny hangover, so that for a marginally higher fee, you could lean over the cord without completely collapsing. At dawn, the rope was cut. You hit the floor. You left. On freezing nights, the historical record is unflinching. People who couldn't afford even a penny were found dead in doorways by morning constables. Not metaphorically, literally found dead. The coroner's term was exposed to the inclemency of the weather, which was Victorian for, we let this happen and we're going to make it sound like weather's fault. This is the floor. Everything that follows is what people did when they couldn't afford the floor. Number 6. Snowing. Stealing warmth. Off the line. Clothes were not a luxury in Victorian Britain. They were survival infrastructure. An overcoat was insulation. Boots were the difference between frostbitten feet and functional ones, which is why stealing them became a profession with its own vocabulary. Snowing was the underworld term for harvesting laundry off washing lines, named with a certain grim poetry for the white linen flapping in the cold air. But it went far beyond opportunistic line raiding. Gangs descended on washerwomen, carrying clothes to drying grounds, and stripped the baskets entirely. Burglars targeted houses specifically for wardrobes rather than silverware. A good coat was easier to sell, harder to trace, and immediately useful. The truly specialized operators were called skinners. These were, and the historical record is completely unflinching about this, usually women. They would lure well-dressed children into alleyways, strip them efficiently of every item of clothing, including their boots, and send them home in their undergarments. Fast, low risk, and appallingly effective. The cruelty of it is inseparable from the logic. When warmth is the primary scarcity, warmth is what you steal. Number 5. Sleeping by the ovens, the geography of stolen heat. Not every survival method in a Victorian winter required stealing from someone. Some required stealing from somewhere. Specifically, from the warmth leaking out of buildings that had no interest in sharing it. Bakeries ran their ovens through the night. The hot air venting from their walls and gratings was, in a frozen city, an unofficial resource. And the homeless and outcasts knew exactly where every bakery vent in their district was located. In cold weather, contemporary accounts from the 1860s describe groups congregating on the flagstones directly above bakery ovens, pressed against warm brick walls, clustered around any gap in a building's exterior that exhaled heat. Railway arches were another geography. The brick absorbed warmth from passing engines, held it for hours, and provided overhead shelter against rain and snow. Covent Garden's market kept fires burning through the night to protect produce from frost. And there were always bodies pressed into the edges of that warmth by morning. This was not organized crime. It was organized survival. But it was survival conducted on property that didn't belong to you, in locations where you were technically trespassing by people the law defined as vagrants, which was itself a criminal offense. The Vagrancy Act of 1824 was still actively used to prosecute people for sleeping rough. Finding warmth if you were destitute in Victorian Britain was a criminal act by definition. Number 4. Pack sleeping in the rookeries, the criminal warmth economy. Here's something that doesn't make it into the sanitized history. In the worst rookeries, St. Giles, Jacob's Island, the Old Nickel, the common lodging houses were so overcrowded that the overcrowding itself became a survival mechanism. Bodies produce heat. Everyone in a Victorian slum understood this in an immediate, practical way that modern people generally don't have to. Packing 12 people into a room built for 4 wasn't just poverty. In January, it was the difference between waking up and not. The shared warmth of packed human bodies in an unheated room was not a side effect of destitution. It was the point. The criminal dimension. Many of these lodging houses operated outside any regulation, charging for floor space by the body, run by landlords who were themselves figures in the criminal economy, providing safe houses for thieves, fencing stolen goods, taking a cut of everything that moved through their territory. Staying in one of these places meant embedding yourself in a network whether you wanted to or not. The price of warmth was proximity to people who expected things in return. One doctor inspecting a St. Giles cellar room in the 1840s described finding humans, dogs, and hogs sharing the same floor. He noted he could not find his patient without a candle at midday. This was not a failure of Victorian civilization. This was its deliberate design. Number 3, poaching, the countryside's year-round survival crime. In rural Britain, the winter criminal economy ran on something older and more organized than urban theft: poaching. Game laws in Victorian England were brutally stacked in favor of landowners. Rabbits, pheasants, deer, animals that ran across open land with no particular loyalty to property boundaries, were the exclusive legal property of whoever owned the ground beneath their feet. A starving agricultural laborer whose work had dried up with the harvest had no legal claim to any of it. The animals were right there, in the fields he could see from his window, and the law said they weren't his. This produced a counter-economy of considerable sophistication. Winter poaching gangs weren't desperate men stumbling around with snares. They were organized operations with lookouts, escape routes, and buyers arranged in advance. Frozen ground actually helped. It was quieter underfoot than summer mud, and game congregated around the same water sources in cold weather, making them predictable. A good night's work could yield enough to feed multiple families and still leave surplus to sell to rural innkeepers who quietly accepted that they would not always ask precise questions about provenance. The gamekeepers employed to stop them were legally empowered to shoot. Some did. The poachers understood this and came in numbers large enough to make that calculation complicated. Number 2, getting arrested. On purpose. Prison as winter shelter. This is the entry that tells you everything you need to know about Victorian Britain. Victorian prisons were designed to be miserable. The official philosophy, articulated without embarrassment, was that conditions should be severe enough to deter reoffending: hard labor, hard fare, hard board, the treadwheel, oakum picking, silence enforced by rule. It was not meant to be comfortable. That was the entire point. And yet, by mid-century contemporary observers, including Henry Mayhew, who documented Victorian poverty with the detachment of an anthropologist visiting a foreign country, were noting something the authorities found deeply embarrassing. The poorest men on the streets of London were committing deliberate, visible, minor crimes specifically to get arrested. Breaking a window, petty theft in plain sight of a constable. Getting caught was the objective, because prison, for all its designed misery, was warm. It was dry, it provided food, poor food, monotonous food, but food. It had a bed of sorts. One Victorian source put it with terrible plainness. For a man struggling through a London winter on the streets, prison offered better food, a warm room, and a bath. The system built to punish the poor was, for the very poorest, a survival resource they were actively trying to access. The authorities' response was to make conditions worse, on the theory that if prison remained preferable to freedom, the deterrent had failed. The idea that the streets might simply be too brutal to survive did not, as a rule, enter the official analysis. Number 1, body snatching, the winter trade. That accidentally built modern medicine. Winter was, by grim logic, the best season to be a resurrectionist. Body snatching, the exhumation and sale of fresh corpses to London's medical schools, was one of the Victorian underworld's most consistent income streams because the medical establishment needed bodies faster than it could legally obtain them. Executions had declined, the Anatomy Acts hadn't yet caught up, and the schools paid 4 guineas for a fresh adult. No questions asked. Here's where the cold comes in, and it's more direct than you might expect. A summer corpse was nearly worthless by the time it reached the anatomy table. Decomposition was fast, and the anatomists needed material they could actually work with. But a winter corpse, dug from frozen ground, transported through cold night air, arrived in usable condition. The resurrection men understood the seasonal economics perfectly. Winter was their high season. Prices were consistent. Demand was reliable. They worked with the efficiency of a skilled trade. Only the head end of the grave needed excavating. The coffin lid was broken, the body pulled free, stripped of its burial clothes. Because taking clothing was actual theft, but taking the body was technically legal, since a corpse was not considered property under British law, and loaded into a waiting cart. John Bishop, leader of London's most notorious body-snatching gang, admitted at trial to selling roughly 1,000 bodies over a decade. Around 60 of those, his eventual confession revealed, had not come from graves. They had been killed for the purpose. His preferred method, laudanum in the drink, followed by drowning in a well. The Anatomy Act of 1832 ended the trade almost overnight by allowing unclaimed bodies from workhouses and hospitals to be used for dissection. No consent required. Being too poor to be claimed was consent enough. Parliament solved the body-snatching crisis by deciding that dying destitute meant the state could do what it liked with you afterward. Victorian progress, in miniature. The thing every single one of these survival methods has in common, the people using them weren't there by accident. They were there because a system built around industrial wealth and the absolute sanctity of private property had decided, very deliberately, that some lives simply weren't worth keeping warm. The outlaws weren't the problem. They were the symptom.